Thank you so very much for that great introduction, and thank you for all of the work your team at the Innovation Center and USDA Rural Development do to make these webinars a success. Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Setting the Pace for a New Era of Rural Electrification. Please forgive us if you hear a little scratchiness in our voices. Here in Washington, D.C., we are experiencing a major carbon event as the forest fires from Canada are dropping lots of smoke on the eastern seaboard, including Washington, D.C. So it's also a timely reminder of the importance of this moment and the opportunity that is ahead of us, in that climate change is something that's very real, that is happening, and increased forest fires, as we've experienced in the western part of the United States, and forest fires up in Canada, are definitely affected by weather conditions. And it's a reminder of the urgency of our efforts to try to decarbonize our environment, to stabilize our climate and to reduce pollution, make everybody happier, healthier, safer, and making power more affordable. So today we're going to talk about our two programs. There'll be some familiar slides, a couple of new ones have been inserted since our last get together. And we have a very, very special feature today. My friend and colleague and someone I admire deeply, Mr. Joe Baden, who has the godfather of our calculator, for carbon calculator, the achievable reduction tool, what we call the art of the possible. I'll be turning over the presentation shortly to Joe, and he will walk us through how the calculator works, some of the core assumptions, and give us a little bit of a demonstration. So without any further ado, I will launch into the overview, just in case those folks, we have some new attendees that may not have heard these slides before, heard these comments before. We're here talking about primarily the New Era program, but I'm going to go through the Powering Affordable Clean Energy, because there are some similar requirements and compare and contrast. So even though Tuesday's presentation was on PACE, we covered some of the Empowering Rural America topics, and today we will be largely focusing on New Era, but we'll cover quickly PACE. Our two programs we're talking about are under the jurisdiction of the Rural Utilities Service. They are extraordinary in and of themselves, but when you consider them in addition to other provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act signed into law by President Biden August of last year, our provisions can be combined with brand new tax incentives related to clean energy investments that are now available for cooperatives, for nonprofits, for municipal utilities, and for tribal utilities. And these tax incentives will be in the form of direct payments to the entities that are investing in these new clean energy technologies. So there'll be investment tax credits and production tax credits, and we are anxiously awaiting the publication of the rules related to those tax credits by the Department of Treasury later this summer, probably later, maybe later this month even. And here at RUS, we do anticipate that our applicants will also be leveraging those new investments, as well as previous investments that are available to those who have ability to use tax credits. So the importance of PACE and New Era is that they are brand new opportunities that put on the table for the first time in the 87-year history of our agency, major grant dollars and loan forgiveness dollars. Our goal is to reduce pollution, improve health, reduce energy costs for rural America. This is a once in a generation, if not once in a lifetime, maybe once in a eon opportunity. We consider this the greatest investment in rural electrification since President Roosevelt signed the Rural Electrification Act in 1936 into law. Go to the next slide. Okay. Quick overview of PACE. PACE sends funding through Section 317 of the Rural Electrification Act. The whole point here is to increase clean energy in rural America, make it significantly more affordable for consumers, especially in energy distressed, disadvantaged, and tribal communities, so that we can heat, cool, and filter the air in the homes across rural America, help folks run their businesses and farms, power cars and schools and hospitals. What PACE does is provides partially forgivable loans for utility scale clean energy projects. Section 317 of the Rural Electrification Act defines those technologies as wind, solar, hydropower, biomass, and geothermal. And then the Inflation Reduction Act itself adds energy storage, which supports those renewable technologies as an additional eligible purpose for this funding. So you can roll out a renewable project with storage to support that renewable project, or storage in support of an existing renewable project, or a new investment in an existing solar project that would, or renewable project that would increase the output from that project. We are having a two-step process in the application process here. The first one will be the submission of a letter of interest. The gate on those submissions will open very shortly here, coming up on June 30th. My friend and colleague Bob Coates conducted a webinar yesterday that focused on Tuesday on PACE, and talked about some of the issues in the letters of interest. We have published a letter of interest template for the PACE program, and a similar letter of interest template for New Era is going through the clearance process right now and being prepared. So stay tuned for a second letter of interest template. But PACE, which has the most imminent opening date, the template has been published. LOIs under PACE are going to be considered on a rolling basis and will be evaluated as they come in. And if you are invited by the agency to prepare the agency will review the LOIs and then determine their eligibility, their feasibility, their prima facie plausibility, their ability to be executed in the time allotted. And then if you pass those tests and we don't run out of money, you get an invitation of the agency to submit a full application. The idea is to have a manageable first step, so that, because we have no idea how many folks are going to show up for this opportunity. Same thing with New Era. We wanted a manageable first step. We'll have letters of interest. Then we'll have to the letters of interest should be a manageable task for anyone seriously in the electric business. You have to basically tell us all of the who, the what, the where, the when, the how much, the how soon, and how much you would like to request, how much it's going to cost. Let us all know the basics through the LOI, as the template will walk you through. In New Era, we're going to talk about the little extra data that we'll need in order to do the rankings. So here we don't have a competition per se. We will consider applications as they come in on a rolling basis. So next slide. And if you do get an invitation to apply, that's where the bigger lift is. We're cognizant in this two-step process, make sure that folks don't expend a lot of money, only to find out, oh, sorry, we're out of money. Anyone who is eligible to apply for the RUS loan program is also eligible to apply for PACE. So that would include for-profit, investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, tribal utilities, Alaska Native Regional Village corporations, LLCs, developers. You can see the list on this slide. Pretty much anybody in the electric business other than an individual or a partnership of individuals. Eligible activities are for renewable generation from wind, solar, geomass, hydropower, biomass, as well as storage. And then the funding notice also outlines some infrastructure that radiates from these renewable energy or storage projects that are necessary to move the power from where it's generated to where it's needed, that could also be eligible to be included as part of a renewable package under PACE. We've divided the funding into 3 categories, allocating a minimum of $300 million in each category. We have a total of $1 billion of budget authority available to us. Oh, and thank you, Tasha, put into the chat the PACE LOI template for folks who like to be able to see that. Category 1 is for basically anyone who meets the core requirements of our program. Again, all applications have to be financially and technically feasible. They have to be, of course, eligible under the statute, and they have to be securable, because RUS does make secured lending, and loans are really loans. They're at full recourse, and the loan interest rate will be the municipal rate of interest, which we do publish on a regular basis, and that's available on the RUS website. I'll give you some QR codes, which I just found out. QR stands for quick response codes. Those will be at the later part of this presentation. You can click on those to be able to get the snapshot of interest rates. So if you meet the basic requirements, you are eligible to be considered for up to 20% loan forgiveness for your application. Now, if you are in an energy community or a distressed or disadvantaged community, again, the topics were covered on Tuesday's webinar, and those webinars will be available on our website once they go through the compliance process. And so if you missed it, you can catch up and listen at your leisure. But we have some mapping tools that are available to help you determine whether you're if you are in an eligible energy community or in a distressed or disadvantaged community, which would get you eligibility for up to 40% loan forgiveness if 50% or more of your population is served by folks in those targeted communities. And then for those areas consistent with our obligations and commitment to equity and environmental justice, up to 60% of loan forgiveness, our most attractive package we're offering here, is available if the proposed funded service area is located in Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, other U.S. territories, compacted free association states in the Pacific, and if the proposed service area consists of 60% or more of a tribal area or serves an area that is identified as a substantially underserved trust area. Trust areas, of course, are a term that generally describes reservations, areas that are land that is held in trust for the benefit of the tribe. And the project is owned by an Indian tribe defined under the federally recognized Indian tribe list, or their wholly owned subsidiary or instrumentalities, or an Alaska Native corporation, including village corporations. So we'll go to the next slide. All right, now for the main event, Empowering Rural America, New Era. So as I mentioned, PACE had $1 billion of budget authority available. New Era has $9.7 billion. Whole focus of New Era is for resiliency, reliability, and affordability of rural electric system to achieve the greatest reductions in 3 greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions. Here, because we have in the statute that greatest reduction is not a competition, it's, again, will be considered on a rolling basis. Where PACE is available to a wide range of entities that are in the electric business, statutorily, Congress said that New Era funding is reserved for rural electric cooperatives, and that is defined as rural electric cooperatives that are or have been RUS or REA borrowers, or cooperatives that serve predominantly rural areas. In other words, if you've never had any contact with RUS or REA, and then you need to be a rural electric cooperative that serves a predominantly rural area, predominantly meaning 50-50, so at least 50% of your customers need to reside in a rural area, or you could be a wholly or jointly owned subsidiary of such cooperatives. In both cases, PACE and New Era, if you are a current or former RUS borrower, for the purposes of your own application, your service territories are deemed to be rural, so you don't have to go through the predominant test. I also want to point out one more thing on PACE before I forget. PACE does allow applicants to have a combined service area of rural and non-rural customers. Again, if you are not an existing RUS borrower, there you would have a 50% test. So you would have to have at least 50% of your service territory being rural for PACE if you aren't already an existing or former RUS or REA borrower. New Era gives us several types of financial assistance. Whereas PACE was partially forgivable loans, New Era is structured in the way of providing a grant of up to 25% of project costs. And we are offering loans at several different interest rates. You can have it at the federal government's cost of capital, which is basically called the Treasury rate. We would set that rate when you draw the funds. Those you can see, again, when you look at that QR code, you can look at an example of what interest rates would be today if you were to drawing funds from the federal government under the Treasury cost of money loans. Or loans could be at fixed 2% interest rates. And then we have a special interest rate of 0% for those who are in predominantly distressed or disadvantaged or energy communities. Again, consistent with our obligations for Justice 40, we are putting our best financial package on the table to serve communities that have suffered over the time, have been underserved or are distressed or disadvantaged or have been affected by the transition away from fossil fuels. We're also having a very unique opportunity here for those entities that have or will have stranded assets and will be offering an ability to refinance those stranded assets at 0% interest, provided you use the savings from that refinancing to invest in renewable or green or clean energy, eligible clean energy sources. And we will be coming out shortly with some additional guidance on the kind of the mathematics of how stranded asset reinvestment will work. And so, but at 0% interest, it's particularly in this interest rate environment, it is very, very attractive. And these different financing mechanisms, depending on what you choose to do and where you're eligible, can be mixed and matched and combined into a package of financing to be able to support your portfolio of actions to be able to reduce greenhouse gases, the three main greenhouse gases. Now, what can you do with these financial resources? Well, here's exactly from the statute. Gives us a shopping list of things that we would like to incent with these extraordinarily attractive packages. One, you could purchase renewable energy under a power purchase agreement. You could purchase a renewable energy system that already exists, or a zero emission system. You can purchase a carbon capture storage systems. You can deploy or build such systems, or you can invest in energy efficient improvements at the generation level or the transmission level, provided that those transmission investments are in support of renewable energy. And again, you can combine them above, and you can combine them in a combination that works for you in a portfolio of actions that will help you achieve what could be your greatest reduction in greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. Here's a quick recap. Once again, we're going to be the eligible entities, as I said, are cooperatives or wholly or jointly owned subsidiaries of rural electric cooperatives. The eligible uses are for all of those investments I just talked about. And then here too, we're going to operate on a two-step process with letters of interest. They're due a little bit later than the PACE schedule, so we don't have to take them all in at one time. Plus, we know that New Era is a little more complicated. It'll be a little bit more robust, takes a little bit more planning, so we're giving you extra time to be able to put your LOIs together. So we will open the window for the LOIs on July 31st. Then we will close the windows for the LOIs on August 31st. So you have a shorter time to submit, longer time to prepare. We would expect for PACE to have an avalanche of applications probably on day one, maybe in the first hour of day one. And then we're expecting probably to have an avalanche of applications towards the end of the window for New Era. I would urge everybody, however, please, if you are contemplating an application, that you plan appropriately. It's human nature to work against the deadline, but sometimes it's dangerous to work against the deadline. I used to be in private practice. I recall one very tense evening where it was a midnight deadline in the American Recovery Act, where we were submitting at 5 minutes to midnight our client's package. Thank God it got through, and I believe it did pretty well in the competition, but things can happen. You know, your internet could go out, power could go out, so please plan appropriately. Don't work up against the deadline if you can, and give yourself adequate time so that you can relax and not have to worry about last-minute system failures. So the letter of interest must meet the minimum requirements, and we will do an initial preliminary score based on the letter of interest, because among the things that will be provided will be information related to the achievable reduction tool that Joe will be able to describe shortly. And then he'll explain to us other elements about the project, including how it contributes to reliability, resiliency, and affordability. In both PACE and New Era, we are expecting our applicants to be able to demonstrate to us that with the financial assistance you would be receiving from the Rural Utility Service, that you will be able to be offering your customers lower costs than you would have otherwise. So we want to be able to demonstrate that there are consumer benefits in your projects. Full application will then be the second step. Same thing, we will take the applications, array them from greatest to least, and then those that are in the money, in other words, we have sufficient funds to be able to make offers to invite you to provide a full application. The high scoring applicants will be invited to submit a full application. Full proposal in both PACE and New Era will have a preliminary deadline of 60 days. However, it's 60 days from the date of invitation or a date that's mutually agreeable to the agency and the applicant. So we know 60 days is an aggressive schedule. We hope people can meet that time frame, but we do understand that complexity and need come into play. So we would consider mutually agreeable dates. But one of the reasons we're on such a tight time frame is that all funds need to be dispersed by the end of the fiscal year for 2031. And when it comes to utility scale investments like we're talking about here, that's really not a lot of time to get through everything, including environmental review. In both cases, we do reserve the right to negotiate the final package of assistance. So just because you ask for it doesn't mean you're going to get it. But we do want you to tell us within the parameters of this funding notice what it is you need to be able to get your projects done and completed and up and running, and show us how it is beneficial to your consumers. Now, we're in both PACE and New Era. We're asking applicants to have one application per program and not to have duplication within the program. In other words, you can have a PACE application and you can have a New Era application. They just need to be for different projects. But we do ask you to have one application. One application can have multiple projects. PACE does have a $100 million ceiling and a $1 million floor. New Era has a couple of limitations. One is that no single entity can receive more than 10% of the budget authority available. In other words, that's $970 million, 10%, the simple math of the $9.7 billion. Grant funding is limited to 25% of the total cost of the proposal. And again, loans could be as low as 0% or as low as 2%, or at Treasury rates of interest. So, and you can decide, you can put together your portfolio of actions. Some of those portfolio of actions may be eligible for different pieces, and you can ask for, what we'll do is evaluate those portfolio actions against the notice, and then work with you in the application process. So I think we'll go to the next slide. So as Joe will explain, you go through the calculator. The calculator will give us 4 values related to carbon dioxide equivalents, which then will allow us to be able to feed those data points into the scoring matrix. Because the statute requires greatest reductions in greenhouse gases, you wouldn't be surprised that the scoring matrix is weighted for up to 30 points for annual tons of carbon dioxide equivalent reductions. And then you could get up to 10 points for carbon dioxide equivalents avoided. Again, the difference is I'm going to replace a carbon intensive asset with a renewable asset. So you are actually reducing your carbon by doing that trade-off. And so that counts as a reduction that would be weighted, again, eligible for up to 30 points. If I'm going to just add new renewable power to my existing power portfolio, that would be carbon avoided. Our theory being, if you weren't deploying renewable energy, well, then you would be dependent on a more carbon intensive source of power. So you're just going to be adding new renewable power, green power, clean power, I should say, renewable or zero emission power. Well, then you would score up to 10 points. There's also 10 points available for your percentage increase in renewable or zero emission energy in your energy mix. It can be owned or purchased. And then you'd also be eligible for up to 10 points for reducing the carbon intensity of your mix. And then the score will be relative to everybody in your category. And I'll get to that in a moment, that we've divided 3 lanes here for the funding opportunity. Joe will show you how the achievable reduction tool will work. And we will use a combination of the achievable reduction tool and the scoring matrix to be able to array the applications from greatest to least levels of carbon reduction. But our evaluation doesn't stop there. There's some additional criteria that can affect your ultimate ranking in addition to greenhouse gas scores. That includes consumer benefits for affordability, project cost per unit of greenhouse gas reductions, the project cost relative to program funding, the geographic distribution of all projects, and then the efficient use of program funds. So in other words, you can imagine two very different projects perhaps scoring identically in the greenhouse gas reduction and the scoring matrix. But if one is 10 times more expensive than the other, well, the less expensive one might be considered a higher ranking project because it offers lower cost per unit of production, reduction of the greenhouse gases, and they would presumably offer a higher level of consumer benefit. So we'll take these other factors into account. Geographic diversity is another example. If all of the applications are concentrated in one state, well, we may want to spread the wealth around, even though someone might rank a little bit lower to be able to have some level of geographic diversity using these funds. We'll go to the next slide. One of the biggest issues that we had to grapple with as we went through the listening sessions and trying to design this program was, well, how do we make this fair? So the ART, the Achievable Reduction Tool, is like one way is to try to take a diverse set of technologies and come up with a common way to be able to sort them. But we also heard, well, the big guys are going to be able to get all the money because that's where the carbon is. They're the ones that have the ability to have great reductions because they're the generators. And what about the little guys? What about those small utilities that need help just as much as everybody else to make these transitions? So in dealing with that, we came up with 3 separate lanes in this competition. You will compete against your peers. So if you are among the larger rural electric cooperatives, probably generation, transmission, utility, with a total utility plant value equal to over than $500 million, you would compete in category 1. Because that's also the biggest source of carbon, or as sometimes they say, hunt where the ducks are, that at least 60% of the funding is reserved for category 1. To keep opportunities available for those that may have important, but perhaps lower absolute levels of greenhouse gas reductions because they're smaller entities, but still valuable reductions and needed reductions in order to achieve this transition. We created 2 other categories. So the mid-sized category, if you have a total utility plant between $200 and $500 million, you'll be eligible for up to 20% of the funding. And then for those in the lower category of less than $200 million total utility plant, up to 20% of the funding is made available for that competition. So you'll have basically 3 separate competitions. You'll compete against your peer, so we don't have the smallest distribution cooperative competing against the largest generation and transmission rural electric cooperative. Also, to provide opportunities for smaller applicants who we know sometimes have relatively small staffs, certainly don't have grant or loan and grant application experts. We know that that there might be some advantage to be able to offer consolidated groups or coalition LOIs so that folks, particularly smaller entities, can be able to join forces, share some of the application costs, share some of the ease of working together. So we will entertain consolidated LOIs. And so multiple groups can come together in a single letter of interest for consideration. The financial commitments for each one of those consolidation partners or those joint letter partners will be disaggregated unless the group itself opts to be jointly and severally liable for the proposed project or projects. And then group LOIs will compete in the category that reflects the value of their combined total utility plant, the combined value of that. So there might be some little strategery going in terms of how big your coalition is and what category you want to land in. But it's an option that'll be available for those to be able to join forces and share costs. And then, again, one option is to have a single LOI, then get to the, if it gets into the finish line, then that single LOI would break into separate invitations to apply and separate applications. Again, unless you are committed to stay jointly and severally liable for the whole project. And the shared application can work for disparate projects, or it could work for percentage ownership of a single asset. We'll go to the next slide. All right. So the New Era letters of interest, and we should have a template available shortly. It is going through the final stages of editing and approval, but they must be submitted electronically. We will be providing more information on the exact method of electronic submission. We have some webinars scheduled to go over that. We'll start accepting New Era LOIs July 31st, 11:59 a.m. Eastern, and no later than August 31st, 11:59 a.m. Eastern time. So the LOIs will have the template, but they'll have to have all the basic elements outlined in the funding notice. Key is to provide sufficient information so that we're able to determine that you meet all of the requirements of the program. We can understand what it is you propose to do, and that you have a good faith commitment to be able to meet all of the program conditions and requirements. Both of these programs are at their heart loan programs. They're loan programs, which much the way we've conducted loan programs for the 87-year history of this agency under the Rural Electrification Act, but it's got a bonus on the back end. And for both PACE and New Era, we will be holding either the debt forgiveness or the grant till the end of the process. So after the project is up and running, validated, that's when you'll get either your debt forgiveness and loan forgiveness in PACE or your grant in New Era. And then for the loan portion, we've talked about this in previous webinars, but we have basically two kinds of financing available at RUS. One is called a system loan. That's the kind of loan that we've had with many of our 600 customers, some going back to the 1930s, where we have a lien on the electric systems assets and all their assets and all their after-acquired assets. We get our security from the operation of the electric system and all of the assets under the umbrella of the electric system. But we also have another option called project financing. And project financing, you take an interest in the one particular project that the applicant is providing. So renewable energy developers who come to RUS over the last dozen years or so have been getting attractive financing on a project level. The difference between system finance and project finance in terms of drawing from your funds is that in a system loan, again, we'll have a lien on the electric utilities system assets. We can consider, provided it's financially feasible, releases of loan funds during construction. In the case of project finance, the agency does not take construction risk. Project financiers will need to be able to find an interim financer while their project is built, and then they will receive their loan funds at the takeout. They'll take out the interim financer at the end of the process when the project is up and running and validated as meeting the obligations. So if you're a project financer, you'll get your loan and your debt forgiveness in PACE and or your loan and your grant in New Era at the end of the process. The one exception in New Era is in stranded asset refinancing. We will consider in stranded asset refinancing the ability to release funds in order to create those resources that you need to invest in new clean energy, eligible clean energy sources. All right, let's go to the next slide. And this is the moment you've been waiting for, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the star of our show today, Joe Baden, and he's going to take us through the achievable reduction tool to show you the art of the possible when it comes to greenhouse gas reductions. So Joe, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And thanks for the good words and the nice introduction. Hello, everyone. For this portion of the webinar, I'll go through a slide or two that introduces the greenhouse gas tool, the achievable reduction tool, or ART, and then walk you through the structure, the logic, and the information flow through the model and the calculator and what it's trying to achieve. And then go through the template, walk you through what you'll see in the template of the tool, and then one generic test case. On the IRA webpage, you'll see the template, you'll see the 4 generic cases, and you can look at all of those. There's 2 generic cases for generation and transmission co-ops, or G&Ts, and there's 2 generic cases for distribution co-ops. So we'll jump into this and dig into the model, get off the video and go through this. So the greenhouse gas tool we're using is the Achievable Reduction Tool, or ART. We wanted to make sure it was simplified, it had easy to follow assumptions, and it would be on a platform everyone is used to. So it's an Excel-based spreadsheet. We try to keep it, as I said, standardized, simplified, and provide a level playing field for everyone. And I'll go through the structure and how everything flows through it. We believe it's very flexible in terms of how the inputs are put in, and it will cover a large range of situations. It may not cover everything, so we also have a notes tab where you could submit additional information that may not be captured there, or since we aggregate a portfolio of actions or projects, you can delaminate those actions within your letter of interest, but also in the note tabs. So we can understand where your megawatt hours displaced or added are coming from. The calculator uses the EPA eGrid factors for emission factors, and That's how our greenhouse gas reductions based on different fuel categories and our greenhouse gas avoided calculations are based on. And we've met with EPA and Department of Energy and had these assumptions and factors validated by them. Then the calculator calculates a set of metrics, both on a mass or tonnage basis and a rate-based percent increase or decrease basis. And the metrics that are in this model are only going to be used for one purpose: proposal scoring and ranking within the peer group categories that Chris presented. It does not show you your score. We have an internal spreadsheet that will scrape the metrics from this tool and assign the points and go forward for the ranking that way. So let me go to the next slide and you'll see the flow of information a bit better. Okay, this is pretty much the flow of the information of the ART or greenhouse gas tool. In the town hall meetings that we had prior to these webinars, we got a lot of information from stakeholders and other groups. They were concerned about how we were going to calculate the reduction or maximum reduction, achievable reduction of greenhouse gases. And they said that they recommended don't do it on a project basis because larger projects will get larger metrics and benefits than smaller projects. It should be based on system impacts. And we took that to heart, and that's the basis or the baseline of this achievable reduction tool. The tool basically goes through 4 phases of information. We get a baseline of your system, then we ask for input of your portfolio of projects or actions. Then we look at the output of megawatt hours, because megawatt hours are what's responsible for emission reductions, not megawatts. So this is all on megawatt hours. And I should say current borrowers of the program would be familiar with these types of data that we request. They annually provide it to us on their Form 7s and 12s of their operating reports. So we ask for your system baseline. We ask for your project portfolio information. The output is allocated in terms of renewable energy, zero emission, and we determine a new system supply mix. And then based on comparing the new mix to the other mix, your baseline, we get a set of metrics. And I'll go back to the system. Basically, what the comparison in this model is, it's comparing a baseline year of 2022 with a future year when all of your proposed projects, portfolio of projects, are up and operating in the year 2032. So basically, that's what we're comparing: a snapshot prior to IRA and a snapshot after IRA. So let's look at the baseline system. We're asking to describe your system's current annual fuel and supply mix. That includes what you generate and what you purchase. So we'd like 2022 to be your baseline year. Provide us all your total output of megawatt hours to your system. How much of those megawatt hours were generated by fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear, and renewables. Of course, we know you have renewables operating today. And what the mix of your purchased electricity? How much are you purchasing on the market and bulk grid purchases? What are you purchasing from wholesale power agreements, from particular fossil fuel plants, from nuclear, and what PPAs you might have with renewable systems? We'd also like you to provide your transmission system losses, because some of your proposed projects will reduce your system losses, and we'd like to give credit, obviously, of your actions that are going to reduce your level of system losses from where they are now to where they'll be in 2032. After we described and quantified your current system, we move on to the project portfolio, what your proposed set of actions are. And we'd like to know the capital cost of your projects, what your loan and grant amount requested is, and what the total megawatt output of your proposed project portfolio is. And you can put in tab B in notes what the different projects are that you'll also have in the LOI. So if there's anything you want to point out that makes up these totals, it's documented. Next, we look at system integration, how the portfolio impacts your system. So we ask for what your plans are in the next 10 years for your legacy system. Are you planning a reduction in fossil generation and purchases? Are there stranded assets that you're taking out of service? Are you doing green or clean fuel switching or some co-firing with renewables? All that can be captured in this model. And then the integration of your project, how much of the project output is going to then replace the fossil generation and purchases you just told us about in the prior bullets. And then what of your proposed projects are additions for system growth? The first bullet of replacements are your greenhouse gas reductions. Your additions are your greenhouse gas avoided, as Chris gave a great definition and outline. We also asked what CO2 sequestration projects you may have and how many tons per year of CO2 you plan on capturing and sequestering. Also, your system loss reductions. That could be based on power flow simulations you may have done and putting the output of those simulations for your system baseline and for your new system in 2032. Then with all of this data, we can then calculate a new supply mix. And at this point, we have your baseline supply mix, we have your proposed future supply mix. And that gets us into the greenhouse gas metric section of the model. And with that, we can then show, based on the greenhouse gas levels of the baseline and the greenhouse gas calculations of the new mix, how much is a reduction, how much is an avoidance. And again, those are based on the EPA EGRID factors. We look at the greenhouse gas reduction based on the fuel mix and the avoided based on the growth. And it calculates a set of metrics: tons of CO2 equivalent reduced, tons of CO2 equivalent avoided, your changes in the percentage of renewables, your change in the percentage of carbon intensity. And then it also calculates cost effectiveness based on the project costs and your requested amount of funds or financing divided by the total tons of CO2 equivalent reduced and avoided. So we get actually 4 different cost effectiveness factors there. So basically, I know this is a quick run through. This is kind of the structure, the information flow or logic through this simple calculator. Now, if you look at this and you're still not convinced this can indicate what your actual greenhouse gas savings are, again, you can note that in the notes tab, and add whatever other assumptions and tell us more about your system, or provide another tool and give us your assumptions, output, and how it differs from this tool, so we have an idea why you're not using it, but we recommend you use it. We think it can give a good level playing field comparison from one proposal to another. And I think that's a pretty strong thing for a simple accounting calculator to do for each of these new era proposals. So from this point, I'm going to share my screen, go through the template, so you see the structure of the model, and I'll go through one G&T generic test case, and then hand it back over to Chris, and we can take questions then. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and get to the template. Okay, can you see the template here?
Oh. Yes, we can.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Looking good.
Thank you very much. Yeah, when you get to the template, and again, it's on the IRA link to the calculator, you'll have the following tabs: a welcome screen that'll give you a summary of what the tool's supposed to do and the purpose of it and what's eligible, the calculator worksheet itself, the notes tab, and the emission factors used. So it's pretty transparent what our assumptions are. So of course, going through the welcome screen, you'll see that this is a simplified tool to be standard to try to capture the system impacts of zero emission systems and renewables, and give a snapshot from 2022 to the end of 2031. And it tells you what the different tabs are and a step-by-step instruction of how to fill in the calculator worksheet. And tab B for the notes, tab C for the factors. So I'll take you to the emission factors. And what you'll see here is for purchase power and grid averages, we have CO2, N2O, and methane factors on pounds per megawatt hour for eGrid on the total US grid. To the right of that, I did a calculation based on the Energy Information Administration, EIA numbers, just to make sure that the eGrid numbers were in the ballpark, and we were confident in the CO2 equivalent pounds per megawatt hour. And we had very good agreement to make the equivalent CO2 factors from nitric oxide and thing. We have the multipliers we've used here. This is from the UN carbon panel, and I've also looked at it from NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab. And then also we have the avoided CO2 factors based on marginal emission factors from eGrid. And then for reductions, we have the eGrid and the calculated factors for a coal steam plant, the natural gas combined cycle, oil, nuclear, and renewables. So these are the factors used for reductions. I should also mention that the grid purchases as well as natural gas emission factors are very close to each other, and that's going to help simplify certain assumptions in the worksheet. So you can look at these factors, and that these are the main multipliers or factors in getting from megawatt hours to tons of CO2 equivalent. And we want to be very transparent, show you what we're doing and what the equations are. And if you look at the, I'll go to the worksheet, to the formula pages, they're also done in English rather than numbers, so you can follow what's being done. On the worksheet, all the gray fields are inputs. All the green fields are calculations. So we're going to ask input on all the gray fields, all the gray cells. So we'll ask you first for your eligible entity, the legal name, your project or proposal name, the date. Here's a reminder of what the eligible actions or projects are. And part one, as I said, is to determine the baseline. You enter the baseline year. It's a drop-down menu. And basically, you'll tell us your whole megawatt hour output for 2022, how that breaks out in your generation, how it breaks out in purchased electricity. We have error message checks to make sure that everything you inputted as part of your generation or part of your purchases equal out. So if there's a mistake, you'll get an error message. There's also going to be a check of the total purchase and the total system supply. So I try to put in many error messages and checks in this as I could think of. So you can go back and check your input. Then what your grid losses are. And again, if you're not doing anything to reduce grid losses, you can leave things 0 or blank. If your system is all generation, fill those in. And if there's no purchases, leave them blank. If you're a distribution co-op and you're all purchases and no generation, leave the top blank and just fill in your purchases. That's all fine. Then after your baseline is determined, we'll want to know about your portfolio of projects, and that's part 2. So we'll ask what the total capital costs of those projects are and what you're requesting in our US loan and grant combination. Then we'll ask what the total megawatt hours of all your new renewable projects are and a typical, or what you think the average useful life of all those projects are. And with all the useful life, we ask that it's not more than 30 years, and there's a check on that as well. And it will calculate the weighted average life of the terms of either the purchases or the generation based on the megawatt hour. We'll do a weighted average life, and that'll be the calculation for the analysis time frame of cost competitiveness or cost efficiency or effectiveness. So there's a weighted average life for all your actions here. So we ask for, as I said, the zero emission generation and purposes. We ask for what are your plans on your non-zero emission assets that you have. You know, how much of your coal assets are you going to be taking out of service? How much of your, let me just make sure, purchase energy. Yeah, this is, I'm going out. This is the losses. This is what you're actually going to apply. Yeah, this is how much you're phasing down your assets in coal and natural gas and oil. So you input how much of your total system is going out of service of the non-zero, what your carbon capture and sequestration is, and any reduction in losses. Then from that point, the calculator would calculate and what your total zero emission supply from your renewables, nuclear, others. And then it would calculate the total mix. So it kind of takes all your input and sets it up into a matrix that we can start calculations on. So we ask for a set of input, then it gets put into different matrices or tables that we can start calculations. So in this new zero emission supply, we've taken all your input and set it into a matrix with some checks and error messages if something doesn't balance out. So the first thing we ask for is from all your zero emission supplies, what are you applying to coal, natural gas, and oil? And cannot exceed column is based on what you've said you're going to dial down or phase down of your assets in the section above it. So there's a check that you're not replacing more than you're taking out of service. Also with this, we'll get to that. We're not going to give credit for proposals that serve less load than their baseline. You're not going to get credit for reducing greenhouse gas for producing less overall. And I'll show how we handle that. So in the first set of inputs, you'll input how much your renewables are going to displace your phased down coal generation. If you have nuclear, how much renewables are going to replace natural gas, how much renewables are going to replace coal or diesel. And it'll calculate what's remaining of your proposed output and check that it's not exceeding what you're taking out of service. Then the next set of boxes will be, you'll allocate how much of the renewables and zero emission projects are going to replace your purchased coal, natural gas, oil, and bulk grid purchases. So you'll assign in these gray boxes megawatt hours. And in the green boxes, they'll make sure you don't assign more than what's remaining of your output of your proposed portfolio of projects. So there's checks of it can't exceed and what the totals are. Now, at this point, if your allocation of proposed projects in generation and supply still don't cover everything you've taken out of service, we will then calculate bulk grid purchases to make up the difference. And again, you might be using additional natural gas, you may be doing bulk purchases. From an emissions perspective, the calculations will give us very similar results. Now, at this point, the model kind of does a summary of where we're at in the allocations. And then will tell you what's left in terms of your proposed project output for system growth. Because up to this point, we've just done replacements of non-zero emission or your legacy generation and supply mix. So what's left after those allocations is what's available for system growth. And table 5 gives you a summary of that, because that's the calculation for greenhouse gas avoided versus greenhouse gas reduced. And from this point, we then summarize all the project output allocations. So you can then see the results from all those stepwise allocation tables. So it'll tabulate what they are. Based on that allocation and your baseline, you'll get to the right a new system supply mix of zero emission generation with your portfolio of new projects, your fossil-based generation with the dial back and replacements, and then your new purchase supply mix. And from that point, we have everything we need to get to part 3 to calculate greenhouse gas emissions. And first, we'll have the baseline supply mix, the new supply mix, and it'll add up to 100% in each column. From that point, using the eGrid multipliers, we'll get CO2, nitric oxide, methane of your baseline, and the equivalent CO2 using the average weighted lifetime. You'll get the lifetime CO2 tons. Then we'll look at carbon intensity. And to the right, we'll be calculating your greenhouse gas mix of your new system, the snapshot in 2032, in both reduction and avoided, and lifetime as well, annual and lifetime. And then we'd be calculating this system carbon intensity of the new system. And the metrics will then be calculated on a ton basis, separating reduction and avoided on an annual and percentage basis, and then lifetime and cost effectiveness, both project dollars per ton reduced, RUS dollars per ton reduced, project dollars per ton avoided or reduced and avoided, and RUS dollars per reduced and avoided. And then these metrics, again, will be used for the scoring and ranking of just greenhouse gas impacts, because there's other factors beyond that, but this is this portion of the evaluation. And again, in the template, we have a note section, and I showed you the emission factors. At this point, I'll show you one example just to see some numbers in that in each place. Yeah, here we go. This is a test case for a large generic G&T. They're going to put in 1,000 megawatts of, could be any renewable, either one or many projects. It could be 10, 100 megawatt projects. The output of these projects is going to contribute to the phase down of non-zero emission assets, as well as some growth in the system. So as you can see in this particular case, everything is generated by this G&T. There's no purchases. There's a check of the system supply. There's no grid loss reduction plan, so we left it blank here. This is the project cost and what's being requested. And this is the output of all these projects in megawatt hours. Say there's a 25-year useful life. And then we ask what are you going to dial back or take out of service? So the plans for this G&T, they want to take 5 million megawatt hours of their coal generation out and 200,000 megawatt hours of their diesel. So that's what they plan to do. And based on that, we get into the allocation. The calculator takes down the information that there's 2,600,000 megawatts in the whole portfolio that's proposed. It's all renewables, and it does a check. Then we allocate so much of that output to reduce the 5 million in coal, and you see the total is 745,000 megawatt hours. It can't exceed the 5 million that's being taken out of service. There's 100,000 megawatt that we're assigning to replace diesel, and it can't exceed the 200,000 we're taking out of service. And it shows what we have remaining for growth. And since this G&T doesn't have any purchase power, we leave this blank. It can't exceed zero. And since these projects didn't replace all the legacy system, there's going to be 4,355,000 megawatt hours of bulk supply that has to be purchased. And then after this, we see there's 1,755,000 megawatt hours remaining for growth in the system for 2032. And there's a little summary table after that. Then based on that, the calculator will tabulate the output and make sure it adds to the 2,600,000 of all the projects. It'll look at the baseline mix, put in the new mix, and you'll have the new supply mix, and it's greater than the 19 million that was there before because there's growth. And there's checks for that within the spreadsheet. And then you'll see what the mix is from the current system and the new system. So before, there was only 6.5% of the mix that were renewable. After the IRA projects, it tripled to 18%. Coal halved from 56 to almost 28% of the mix. Natural gas went down, kept about the same. We should see diesel went in half, and it all adds up to 100%. And based on these mixes, the grid factors, you're going to get what the baseline emissions were, what the new emissions were, and from the growth, what the avoided were. You'll see the carbon intensity gets reduced. The metrics are provided here. The cost effectiveness is here. And this gives you a general gist of, how this simple calculator works. So from this point, you can stop sharing the screen. Go over to Chris so we can take some questions.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Again, a remarkable presentation and a remarkable calculator that you have devised and vetted with other federal agencies. I'm going to give you a chance to rest your voice a little bit, and I'll go a few items, and we're going to throw open for some questions. So just a quick reminder, here is the calendar of events. We've kind of emphasized the July 31st deadline, and then the closing date will be August 31st for LOI submissions. We will be considering those LOIs in September, turning around as quickly as possible for invitations to submit full applications. And then we need to have everything finished, completed, all the funds dispersed no later than the end of the fiscal year 2031. We expect to make most of our awards in fiscal year 24. In the calendar, that would be somewhere like in the December on forward, and then they'll be mostly 24 and 25. We expect we're going to get some pretty complicated packages, portfolios of actions to go through, but the important thing about the achievable reduction tool is it's not meant to be a crystal ball. It's really not to, it's not a predictor, but it is a sorting tool to allow us to array these applications and into the greatest to least carbon reduction. And remember, you will be competing in your own category. Go to the next slide. Here's our latest schedule of upcoming webinars and a QR code to be able to link into the web page. So the next one will be on June 22nd, where we'll be holding office hours. So June 22nd and July 6th. That will be mainly just taking your questions and answering as best we can. And then we'll have some demos on how to submit. Please use your QR code to sign up for future notifications and registration. Go to the next slide. And some more QR codes for you to use. One for the IRA webpage, one for the electric program, one to sign up for our notification system, one on sam.gov. And so anyway, it's all there. Please, if you don't have sam.gov already, please go ahead and get yourself registered. There is sometimes a waiting list on sam.gov, and we want to make sure that you are registered in time. So please, even if you're thinking about applying for these funds, you need to get your registration in, and if you have a registration, please make sure that it is still eligible. So we're going to go to some questions next. And we've got a big stack of questions, and I think I even have everybody's favorite host of these webinars, Claire, on the line. Claire, if you're there and you can join us for a few minutes, I know you've got some other commitments. We can toss around some questions.
Happy to. Mostly, I'll just start by reading the questions, and some of them I'll throw to you, Chris. But the first question we have here is from Eddie Quinn, who's asked, what types of collateral requirements do these loans require?
Okay, so there needs to be reasonably adequate security to be able to ensure that the loan gets repaid. In a system loan, we typically have a lien on all the assets of the system, and we're always, the U.S. government is always in the first position. We can do a shared first position or pari passu in proportion to the first position with other first position lenders. And in some cases, when you are, let's say, a tribal entity or a municipal utility, sometimes you're not able to pledge hard asset collateral. We will work with tribes often on pledges of revenues. And then sometimes we will take other forms of credit support to be able to back the loans, perhaps like a guarantee from a third party or irrevocable letter of credit. But the question highlights a very important part about the RUS program. These are full recourse loans.